Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Insights Interview, where we explore the evolving landscape of finance and technology. I'm Jack Robertson, data journalist at the Payments Association, and today we're talking about the changes to ESG regulation across the EU. 2026 is proving to be a pivotal year for ESG regulation, both with CSRD coming into effect, requiring larger firms to report on their sustainability impacts across their value chain, while CSDDD is taking the next step, arguably, in introducing civic liability for larger organisations. For payments institutions across the EU, the conversation is rotating to no longer just being about compliance. Joining me to explore this critical topic is Sarah Dees, CEO of MyEUPay. Sarah, great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Jack, for having me. Excited to unpack this topic today.
Great stuff. So, as I sort of outlined in the introduction there, 2026 is ramping up to be quite a big year for ESG regulation, both with CSRD and DDD coming into force. But before we get into the details of both of those regulations, which do you think payment firms should be building around the most?
My instinct is CSRD, and here's why that's not the obvious answer. CSDDD feels a lot more urgent. Obviously, you've got that civil liability sort of fear in your head. It's coming, it's coming. But if you don't do the measurement work before, i.e., adopting CSRDD is almost impossible to get a hold of. So definitely, let's start with CSRD. And I think, commenting further on that, CSRD forces you to do the foundational work. It forces you to do the measurement work. And that's a really tricky thing for a lot of firms because a lot of them haven't started and don't really need to start depending on their size. You need to measure before you can take action. And so I feel that still CSRD, a lot of firms need to take that first step in order to get the ball rolling really before they can start to look at CSDDD. But you need to look at them in parallel because that law is coming and no one wants to be in a civil liability situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, as we mentioned earlier, CSRD currently requires larger firms to report sustainability impacts across their value chain, no longer just their own operations. So, where do you see firms struggling most to actually get visibility down that value chain?
To be honest, it's sadly anyone that's really below sort of a big bulge bracket bank. They haven't been required thus far to do the work. Often it's tricky to start the work. They don't have big CSR teams. They don't have an ESG lead. So they're left, and they don't have the expertise. So they're left pretty much at their own devices on what they need to do. So I think anything below tier one really is, I think, going to struggle. And different regulators, by the way, and we have licenses throughout Europe and the UK. Different regulators are already pointing onto the fact that we should be doing continual monitoring of our suppliers anyway. Now, that's done in a slightly different way, maybe not using ESG metrics. So we already are looking at suppliers, but the tricky thing then is going a little bit further down. We know we do billions of payments to loads of different underlying clients, but how do we, particularly if they're SME clients, how do we actually evaluate those underlying clients? What tools do we have in place to do so? Now, if you're a big bank, potentially you've already adopted some carbon accounting measurements, but potentially you've looked at some ways that you can see the underlying transactions, particularly maybe you've got some AI that can data scrape those and find, where those payments are going, which type of companies they are. Maybe some of those payments are going to big firms that already have ESG in the open market or in the public domain, so you can review that. But a lot of the smaller payment firms, and we're there to bring competition to some of the bigger bulge bracket banks, we don't have that type of client base, or we have a different type of client base, and I think trying to get that information is quite difficult.
You mentioned obviously the preparations that are needed, and CSDDD is arguably taking that next step, right? It's no longer just about reporting, it's potentially about that liability impact. So maybe not you specifically, but how do you think this regulation will impact firms and who they should be willing to work with? Does it mark the point where ESG stops being, that phrase that we always hear, a nice to have, and become a genuine business risk?
Yes, the answer is yes. And here's why I think it's a genuine inflection point. CSDDD doesn't just add reporting requirements, it changes the legal relationship between a payments institute and every entity in its chain of activities. Adverse impacts can no longer be just reputational, there's actual civil liability behind it. And I think that fundamentally changes who we're willing to work with. Now, again, that's going to be difficult to transition to because a lot of firms don't have that way of measurement.
Mm.
They know who their suppliers are, but if it's a Microsoft or if it's a big firm like that, you could probably get that information. But what if it's a startup that you're using, or maybe your AML provider that's providing you data is not a huge company? How do you go about doing that? But I think it doesn't only look at, these smaller suppliers and how do we do it, but it's also putting some onus on us on, we need to take some corporate responsibility here, right? So not just from an environmental point, but from a social point, like, are we doing business with good actors? We do a lot of work in AML, and we have some really good tools out there. We have some really good systems and processes and regulatory guidance in place, which the FCA and the PRA do in order to help firms act within their scope. But no one's really looked at, how do I take that AML framework and add additional criteria in, and as a result use that, so when I do get to the point of, oh yes, I have some civil liability, have I got everything in place, there is actually a mechanism to do so. And I think that's not what we have just yet. I think there's some work that needs to be done, but bearing in mind how important that is, and also our civil and social responsibility on doing business with good firms, I think that's something that we really need to start thinking about sooner rather than later.
Mm.
Well, let's look a little bit downstream and upstream as well. So we've spoken a little bit about service providers, that onus on us knowing who we do business with. Sometimes difficult in very big firms. In smaller firms, can be easy. Maybe the founder, but they won't have the processes in place as well. So, you're trying to audit someone that's not been audited themselves just yet, which also makes it complex. And we spoke a little bit earlier about, our underlying clients. We many of us will do billions of business every year, do billions of transactions, but maybe with quite a wide group of clients. And often those clients, as I mentioned before, will be maybe smaller clients that are not subject to this rule. So then you're getting into a situation where maybe you've got to ask information that these guys don't even know themselves. So it's something that's going to require some work. I think we've got some great tools out there already. How do we adapt those rules in order to help firms in the smaller scale that don't quite yet get to that big bulge bracket level?
Mm.
How do we help them, firstly, as we discussed with CSRD, but secondly, how do we help them comply with CSDDD when it comes into place? So I think that's going to be like the next most important thing that we start to consider. And I think there's a gap in the market for maybe some existing suppliers, and we have a tool that does continual monitoring on all of our suppliers, looks at dark web, and even them, they're starting to think about ESG, starting to think about how they can adapt that. So that downstream aspect is also complex.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've sort of built that foundation, right? That understanding of the EU regulatory space. They've obviously laid the groundwork, and they are going to enforce it over the coming years. We've heard from UK regulators that they could potentially be following, a similar path towards enforcement. So, as a sort of, if you're to put your future gazing hat on for a second, what message do you have for payment firms that still think ESG is just an optional?
I think it's a bit too late to think it's a bit of an optional, Jack. I think it's here to stay. It's really hard when something's in 2028. It's hard for people to think that that's going to come sooner rather than later. But when I studied sustainability leadership a few years back, one of the things I was doing as part of my dissertation was thinking about how do we add ESG metrics into normal AML or normal KYC or KYB journey. So people have been thinking about this for a long time. I think the lack of push has meant that some firms have been a little bit slow to adapt, and a little bit, it's next year, it's coming. But not only does it make good business sense to know who you're doing business with in a deeper way, From a socially responsible point of view, it also makes sense. You want to know that you're doing business with good actors. And now, not only do you want to know that from a good governance point of view, but also you need to know that because that is the sort of law that is going to be applied to you, or the regulation that is applied to you that you need to comply with. CSDDD liability kicks in 2028. We've had a long winter. It's the last week. It's rained a lot, but 2028 is not that far away. I feel that it's no longer just a sense of regulation. It's also a sense of kind of doing the right thing in this very complex world that we're in at the moment. I think those firms that really embrace this type of measurement and also look at embedding this within their good governance structure, and think about other things, the social impact, think about also not just the environmental impact, but the social impact. Are we dealing with vulnerable clients well? All of these things that we're measuring that already are part of some other legislations and regulation. I think this brings everything together. There are some big bulge bracket firms out there that have used more carbon accounting, but more measurement in order to use that as a commercial aspect as part of their overall service. As payment service providers, I think we've been slow to do that. I think you still need to make sure that there is a good commercial sense in doing so. But I think now you can't ignore it anymore. I think it makes good business sense. So I would encourage all payment service providers, from SPIs to EMIs and everything in between, VASPs, any non-bank financial institutions, start thinking about this. Find somebody within your team that can be your champion. We've all had consumer duty champions. Let's get people, that are fired up about ESG, and let's adopt this new legislation in a way that is not only the right thing, but that makes good business sense.
Yeah, what a lovely call to action to finish on. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks so much for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Insights podcast. If you'd like to learn more about how MyEUPay is operating across financial services, do visit their website for further resources.
To access more podcasts, videos, and articles, go to thepaymentsassociation.org.